Well, hello, ladies and gentlemen, all those who were kind enough to come on this Tuesday afternoon, at least on the East Coast. Well, I think it's probably afternoon everywhere in America except Hawaii. But thanks for joining us today for what is going to be, I believe, an exceptional webinar on an important topic, education reform. Where are donor dollars most consequential? I'm Jack Fowler. I am the senior fellow at the Center for Civil Society at American Philanthropic. And we try to do these monthly, sort of monthly, we call them. I don't always get my act together, but sort of monthly webinars on topics of importance to civil society, of importance to givers, doers, and thinkers, and philanthropists. And I think today's topic will be a little more, the subject matter is really more about the givers. Where are dollars being spent, being donated, that are having most bang for the buck? We want to have a positive outcome here. We're going to lament. I'll lament, maybe get our participants to lament a little bit about the state of education and why reform is even needed. But I think we have a lot of upside and inspiration that will come through by the end of this hour. So I'm going to introduce our guests one by one and ask them a question after I introduce them. And then we will ask I'll have a series of questions to pose. And if you have any questions in the chat, there's a Q&A function. I see it at the bottom of my screen anyway. Pose a question and I will try to in turn pose it to our speakers. So first speaker, get my notes in order, is Sherry Street, and she is a senior philanthropic advisor at the Bradley Impact Fund. She has particular expertise in uniting stakeholders to advance state public policy for school choice and broader free market reform. Before she was at the Bradley Impact Fund, Sherry was the Vice President of Policy Advancement at the American Legislative Exchange Council, where she collaborated with state legislators to protect free enterprise and individual liberty. She also was at the Illinois Policy Institute, and I think quite cool, Sherry worked with Milwaukee Mayor John Norquist. I think was that back in the 90s to expand the city's school choice program to religious schools. It was really one of the great. I had been the publisher of National Review, and I will say this as a professional conservative, we found what was happening in Milwaukee greatly inspiring, and I think it still inspires people now, all these years later. Sherry, two quick questions. Well, one quick, and then one want to elaborate a little. Would you just tell us about the Bradley Impact Fund, and then I want you to tell us what you think school choices, since this is one of the areas that you have particular interest in through your role at Bradley.
Sure. Well, first of all, I wanted to thank you, Jack, and our other friends there at the American Philanthropic. The Bradley Impact Fund was established to create a network of nationwide network of informed donors who seek to restore, strengthen, and protect America's founding principles and institutions. What I think distinguishes us from typical donor-advised funds is that, along with the convenience of a donor-advised fund, we have the benefit of the expertise of the Lined and Harry Bradley Foundation, as well as a steadfast commitment to donor intent and conservative principles. And so I hope with that short introduction, if anyone is interested and would like to learn more, that they'll visit our website, or better yet, give me a call or shoot me an email. And if you're in the DC area, I'll buy you a cup of coffee.
Sherry, I'll get to this. Let me just interrupt my own asking you questions to say, it is a donor advised fund. That means there are donors. And do you get a sense that now, relative to say a year ago or 2 years ago, but is there particular interest amongst the people who are the donors to the fund in education reform?
I'd say yes. I'd say there's probably a heightened, maybe renewed interest in education reform. And so our challenge is, of course, to help them sort of sort out what is the most impactful way they can engage in, renewing our education and reforming. What are the reforms that would have the greatest impact that they'd be interested in seeing?
So I'm in a bar. I see you. No, we're at a conference for education reform. Look at it that way. Yeah, a cocktail. And just tell me, hey, Sherry Street, tell me, what is school choice? How do you define school choice?
I think of school choice sort of as we do in higher ed. For some reason, K-12 has been limited to a choice of having taxpayer dollars funding follow the children to the places that they want to attend. So, for example, if you are, in higher ed, you can use a Pell Grant to go to any university of your choice. Whether it's religious or otherwise, there doesn't seem to be any concern about that, but only through K-12. So I would envision school choice as a system of dollars following children when their parents are engaged and make decisions on how best to spend those dollars based on the needs of their children.
Next up, Ben Lindquist. Ben is the co-founder and executive partner for Arcadia Education. He is served as the president of the Colorado League of Charter Schools in 2018. Before that, he spent 23 years, and I'm sorry, Ben, I know people tell you this all the time, you look like you've been anywhere 23 years, good genes. He spent 23 years working to improve public education nationally. 10 of those years he spent as a charter school manager, starting public charter schools and serving high poverty urban students. And 10 of those other years were spent as a grant making manager with the Charter School Growth Fund, the Walton Family Foundation, and the Kern Family Foundation. Ben, you've put a lot of your life into charter schools and reform. But now, as the president of Arcadia Education, would you tell us a little bit about that? And I think it's got a different, a broader approach to education reform than merely supporting charter schools. Would I be right about that?
Jack, thank you for inviting me to serve on this panel. It's really something to be serving alongside of Sherry and Bruno, who are two people that I have a lot of respect for in the space. So thank you. Yes, to answer your question, Arcadia Education's focus is on serving K-12 institutions with a center-right set of values and ideological principles. And what we seek to do is to offer them services with a primary focus in three areas: talent and human resources, organizational health, and growth. And what we want to become is the connective tissue that's helping create a center of gravity, a sense of pride, of resources and supports for center-right institutions who are currently kind of navigating cultural and social headwinds in our country that are pretty pronounced.
So Ben, we're talking about, on the Arcadia website, the word leadership is throughout. I assume there's leadership at the school level, but then there are also amalgam or collections of schools. They could be private, I guess, like Great Hearts or diocesan. But you're talking about essentially. Leadership is vital to good education and education reform. Is that a fair enough statement?
Yeah, Jack. Jim Collins, the author of the book Good to Great, one of his tenets is that the who comes before the what. Arcadia Education strongly believes the who comes before the what. And so our first choice is to pick entrepreneurial leadership teams with ideological principles, with the knowledge that we believe should be guiding the direction of K-12 education moving forward. And so we invest a lot of time and energy finding highly qualified leadership teams. They serve in different types of institutions. Examples are the Archdiocese of Chicago, Archdiocese of Boston. Other examples are Great Hearts Academies, the Mount Academy, where I'm doing this panel from today. So those are some examples of the kinds of leadership teams and institutions we support.
Thanks, Ben. Bruno Mano, who I've had the great pleasure through this little newsletter I write for American Philanthropic, weekly newsletter called Civil Thoughts. And I often find myself recommending, of the dozen recommended readings in a week, there's often one from Bruno, who just is a prolific writer and a wise writer. And I think, Bruno, much of the time you are offering people inspiration in the things you write, and maybe that's why you published this book, and it's called The Opportunity to Rise. I hope we get that all on the screen. This is a collection of writings, not much by you, but by many others. I know Caitlin Nocera, who's behind the scenes. She's actually the Wizard of Oz to this webinar. She's going to put up a link to the book, which I'm pretty sure you can get for free at the Walton Family Foundation. But Bruno, yeah, I better read your bio before I say anything. You are the Walton Family Foundation Senior Fellow Emeritus for the K through 12 education program that's focused on grant making and team operations. Before that, before you were at Walton, you were the Senior Program Associate for Education at the Annie E. Casey Foundation. Prior to that, you were the Senior Fellow in Education Policy Studies program at the Hudson Institute. And prior to that, even in the Reagan, the end of the Reagan and the Bush administrations, you worked at the Department of Education in several senior positions, including Assistant Secretary for Policy and Planning. Bruno, you are, it says emeritus, but I really don't think you're retired. You're relentless. So let me just, I'm not going to read from your book here, though, but the one point here is we've just gone through America, and particularly the students in K through 12, well, we'll throw in college too. The last 2 years have been maybe cataclysmic, certainly different, but unlike much we've seen, it has sparked so much political and cultural angst, anger, etc. But it has also revealed opportunities for real education reform. And that, I think, is the purpose of your book. But tell us about that, and tell us why you believe we are at a point right now where ahead for many people, remember, now we're talking about people who may want to support reform, why there is a plentiful opportunities to do such.
Well, thank you for the introduction. Thanks for inviting me. It's nice to be with Sherry and Ben, whom I've known for many, many, many years, going way back. So it's a nice reunion here. About the book, the title encapsulates a sort of mood that I hoped would pervade people's approach to the problems we confront today, which are no doubt serious. Some having existed for quite a while, are young people not knowing what they need to know to live, work, and compete in the 21st century. And then the pandemic having exacerbated that in all sorts of ways. But the opportunity to rise is a sort of hopeful message in the midst of all of that chaos, so to speak. It was sort of inspired by a little phrase that one of my mentors, someone whose name is probably familiar to many folks, Lamar Alexander, used to say. I worked for Lamar at the department for several years. He used to have a phrase, and the phrase he picked up actually from Alex Haley, the author of Roots, with whom he was good friends. And the phrase was, find the good and praise it. Find the good and praise it. So the essays in the book are an attempt to kind of say there's a lot that's going on today that is worth praising and emulating and replicating to the extent that, people pick up on other people's ideas that are good ideas and try to kind of spread them around. So that was the inspiration behind this collection of essays that the foundation gave me the time to to write and were kind enough to put together in the collection that you have in front of you.
One of the articles in this book is by a man named Bruno Mano, but it's a wonderful piece. COVID learning and earning losses could be huge, but there are remedies inside and outside of our schools. Here are 7 of them. This is typical of what you write. You're offering hard practical advice. And I'd like to throw this towards Ben. One of the 7 remedies that you propose in this book is here. It's called recruiting new teachers, and this gets to, again, we're thinking about philanthropists and charitable people. What are they trying to support that's going to be meaningful? And I think we of course will discuss this. I want to give to a school. I want to support a certain policy, but the thought of promoting leadership, which is not only the leader of school, but the teachers, is important. So here's one thing you wrote, Bruno. Recruit new teachers. Soaring unemployment rates and economic crises like COVID-19 bring individuals into the teaching profession from other occupations. Research spanning 6 recessions from 1969 to 2009 of over 30,000 Florida teachers and students show that these recruits are significantly more effective at raising student test scores, especially in mathematics, than those who start teaching when the economy is strong. So weaker job markets are an opportunity to hire individuals from non-teaching occupations, et cetera. I guess the question, Ben, I want to ask you, in your experience, do you think philanthropists get it? Or is supporting that kind of a program or that kind of need something of less interest, even though it might have the most bang for the buck, if the outcome we're expecting is well-educated students?
Jack, that's a good question. I would say that the number one highest priority for any K-12 institution's quality is the quality of its teachers. There is no other thing. Sometimes there's a tendency to focus on curriculum and instruction, on programmatic design. The reality is you can put the right resources in the hands of the wrong people and it will get us nowhere. It's all about the right people. And do I think that philanthropists understand that and put resources behind that priority? I think when they back institutions that understand that and that have effective systems for sourcing, recruiting, qualifying, providing training and support ongoing to teachers, I think that they understand the priority. But I think all too often, philanthropists aren't really directing their resources in a focused way, on a targeted way at that priority. I think it's more picking and choosing which organizations to support.
And by organizations, do you mean more so national organizations engaged in education reform efforts, or in particular brick and mortar institutions?
In the last 10 or 15 years, there's been to some extent a focus on talent pipelines, what donors often refer to as talent pipelines. And that includes organizations like Teach for America, TNTP, the New Teacher Project. I think the challenge with organizations like that is that while they may be recruiting and providing teachers to different types of schooling institutions, they're really quite divorced from the actual employment mediums, the schools, the classrooms where those teachers are going to be teaching. And so I don't necessarily think that that's helped the profession all that much. I would argue instead that it's the charter management organizations, it's the school networks that are actually building out strong, sophisticated talenting and HR systems and practices and then are directly employing teachers and supporting them with the right resources in classrooms and schools. I think that's the most effective aligned way to approach the problem and to address it, kind of overcome it on an ongoing basis.
Bruno, supporting charter schools, the charter school movement, let's call it a movement, is obviously an important matter to many people of charity, but it's a charter schools is a term that applies to things that are varied and different. If you had a minute to explain to some knucklehead named Jack Fowler, like, you don't understand the degree of difference in charter schools, and this is like an aviary where you have eagles and vultures. What are the primary examples of what charter schools are in America?
Yeah, the definition that I would give starts with a very fundamental point, which so many people who don't like charter schools try to convince you is true. But charter schools are, first of all, public schools. Believe it or not, people debate that issue, but they are public schools. But they're different than the traditional district school in that they are autonomous, which is to say, they exist as a separate standalone nonprofit that has its own board of directors, board of governors, that oversees the operations of the school. That's unlike many district schools, the district system, which oversees the schools that are under its auspices and pretty well tells all of the schools that are in the district what they do, when they do it, how they do it, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas I like to think of charter schools as independent public schools that are accountable in very specific ways for what they do, for the results they produce. And you're right to say that, you know, there is no one charter model, and that's actually the sort of beauty of the system, unlike a district model, which tends to be pretty much the same no matter where you go.
Right.
There is this sort of diversity that's built into the charter model that's not part of the traditional district system. I don't want to imply in anything I say here that every charter school is good just because it's a charter school or has the name charter school. Obviously not. There are excellent ones and there are ones that are not so good. But that's sort of, from my perspective, the fundamentals of what a charter is. It's an independent public school of choice that's accountable for the results that it produces under a contract it has with a recognized public agency. And those public agencies are of a variety of different types. It's not just a district. It could be a separate chartering board. It could be a university, et cetera, et cetera.
Sherry, I'm going to ask you about your experience in a minute. I have one more question to ask Bruno here. But your experience in education reform at a ground level and what the key impediments have been in your experience some time ago, and they still persist. So give you some time to think about that. But Bruno, and this may be a little unfair, but a philanthropist who is concerned, wants to help reform education, blanket, broad statement. And yeah, I want to help charter schools. I don't care where they're located, even though I live here. I want to help a good charter school system. First of all, do you think if there's a portfolio of support for a philanthropist in education reform, should charter schools be part of it? A, and B, give us an example or two of a charter school itself or charter school system that you think is punching above its weight because of the disadvantages it's had to overcome, et cetera, but for whatever reason.
Yeah, to your first question, the simple and straightforward answer is yes. It should be part, I think, of an individual's portfolio of investments or whatever euphemism you want to use to describe that. And maybe just take a quick side trip here before I get to the second question. I think the way a donor, and I'll use that word donor in a very broad sense, the way a donor should think about how they might invest in education is to start with a very simple framework. There are investments that you can make in the traditional system, and there are investments you can make outside of the traditional system. It's sort of a very fundamental point, but an important point to keep in mind. And we can argue about how much you should do here, how much you should do there, but I think donors should be encouraged to think about the investments that can be made outside of the traditional system. I'm not arguing that you shouldn't be concerned about the system or do things there, but that's why I would be led to say yes.
Right.
It should be part of your portfolio of investments, because we're learning some very significant things in the charter sector that can help the district sector, and the charter sector is learning that that there are probably some things that the district sector might be doing that can help it sort its own self out in different ways. So there's a reciprocal relationship there. That's a long-winded yes.
Okay. All right.
And then the second part of that, the question,
Geez, what? Now
you can't remember either. No.
I can't remember either. Well, we'll remember and get back to it.
All right.
Let me ask now, though. Let me ask Sherry. Sherry, you've been in the at the barricades and the front lines of education reform for quite a while. What were the impediments in Milwaukee that you experienced? And you don't need to go in a long history about that, but are those impediments that you faced then still existent? And I think I'm going to broaden that out to all three participants. Like, what are the real impediments to education reform in America today? But why don't you lead it off, Sherry, with your background?
Well, I think back then, as well as now, the elephant in the room are public unions. I felt like in the days of our victory, that the doors of freedom would fly open and families and students would be able to choose schools of their choice, all across America. And it wasn't that, quite that way. So there were, certainly the unions fought back. And, at that point, I wondered, is school choice viable? I mean, there were times I thought, was this Milwaukee just an anomaly?
Right.
The right people in the right place at the time and leadership. But as we now know, 30 years later, that isn't the case. It has expanded, but I do feel like we have reached an inflection point. I was listening to Professor William Jacobson. He spoke at the ALEC Education Task Force at their annual meeting. And I agree with him. It's something I've thought about for a long time. It's like, choice is one reform, but we really need to, if we want to holistically improve education, change, that we have to look at the whole infrastructure. So that includes funding. And in my mind, I don't know, Bruno, since you work there, is it time to, shut down the U.S. Department of Education? Do we send that money back to the states? I mean, I think we have to really examine, what is the infrastructure that led us to where we are today, and how do we improve upon that?
Bruno, do you want to take up what Sherry said, and also your thoughts on if there are any different on the impediments to education reform?
Well, certainly the one she mentioned is a significant one, but there are probably as many impediments as you could think about in a baker's dozen at least.
Okay.
I think let me just focus on one. And again, I go back to this contrast between inside the system and outside the system as a way of thinking about this issue.
Right.
The system is constituted to make sure that it survives at all expense.
Okay.
And so it will do anything it needs to do to continue to survive. And that's not just a statement made about education or K-12. I mean, that's generally true of any kind of system that you create. So there are impediments that are around financing. There are impediments around teaching and learning. There are impediments around curriculum and what you can use. So you could go down the list and talk about that which constitutes the system and find impediments in sort of every domain. Contrast that with this other sort of outside the system, and now we're talking specifically about charters, where you have a lot more freedom and autonomy and control over any of the items I just mentioned. You're generally able to hire and fire your own teachers. You're generally able to create your own education program, et cetera, et cetera. So I think one of the sort of we come back to this sort of fundamental inside-outside dynamic, where I think outside the system, you have more freedom to try things out, to experiment, to innovate, to fail, because some of these schools fail at what they do. Whereas the system has a very different kind of approach to those kinds of issues.
Well, I want to get Ben's thoughts on impediments also, but Bruno, you mentioned several times outside the system. So let me just throw something that's outside the system for millions of people, and that's homeschooling. And is that something worthy of donor support? Is it the kind of thing, one of the goals is, I want my dollar to have the most bang for the buck, right? Is that a place where there is a lot of bang for the buck, or is it really just so eclectic and it's great, but it's fun as a thing that's fundable, it's a little hard to figure out.
Yeah, one of the interesting spin-offs of the pandemic and closing schools has been the huge growth in the homeschooling market, particularly on the part of minority families, minority parents. So there's been a huge increase in the number of families taking advantage of homeschooling. Now, we have a conception of homeschooling that pretty much says, here's one kid at home studying by himself or herself. Well, yes, that's part of what homeschooling is, but homeschooling is really taken on all kind of new and interesting dimensions here, where you have homeschooling co-ops, you have some people who may do some homeschooling at home who actually, because of a school choice law that provides them with supplemental funds, is able to take those funds and have, through course choice, a student enroll in a charter school and take some courses there. So this sort of this thing called homeschooling has become much more than an individual student sitting at home with a mother or a father tutoring that child, or perhaps getting some instruction online, to a very, very different kind of way of thinking about how young people can learn. So yes, I do think it's an option, and don't be put off by what you might think homeschooling is, because what's happened, not just in recent times, but certainly fueled by the pandemic, is this sort of explosion in different ways of thinking about how people are homeschooled that involve co-ops and having relationships with other institutions in the community, including some schools. So I do think it's an area where people should at least investigate, if not actually support specific things that are going on there.
I have a question I'm going to ask from one of our participants, but before I do that, Ben, two things. One, does Arcadia have any role in the homeschooling area? If so, what are you seeing? And is it a reform is it part of the reform package for American education? And then, but separately, back to the original question, you've been in the trenches yourself for years and years. What have been and what are the impediments to education reform today?
Jack, the single biggest change that's occurred in the last 30 years that's swept the field of K-12 education has actually been a change in the demographics of the school-age population.
Okay.
Today, over 50% of school-age students are of various minority ethnicities. 30 years ago, only 32% of students were of minority ethnicities. Today, 37% of students, school-age students, live in single-parent homes. 30 years ago, that was only 22%. We have nearly 40% of our students who qualify for the federal free and reduced lunch program, a central measure of poverty today. It was actually a lower percentage 30 years ago. So as a result of that change in demographic composition, we have an incredible heterogeneous diversity of learners from birth to age 18, which is not something that this country was serving 30 years ago to the same extent. What that requires K-12 institutions that can adapt to meet the different individual needs and attributes of every learner. And what we have a largely government-run public system that is compulsory, uniform, and standardized by history, by regulation, by mandate on most state and federal books. And so that public system is unable to adapt to these heterogeneous needs that every learner has today. And as a result, our schools are getting declining outcomes. Through choice, through charters, through tax credit programs, through homeschooling, through various types of choice, even open enrollment across district lines or within districts, we're offering families many more options for placing their students into different types of programmatic settings where their needs can be met. And that is the future of K-12 education in America. We need to move there as quickly as we can. And right now we have an establishment interest that is resisting that change tooth and nail.
I'm glad you repeated the little phrase K through 12, Ben, because when it comes, again, now we're trying to discuss here philanthropy, right? Donors and givers. And the donor who is interested in education, I think personally, too often, the go-to is my alma mater, my college. And especially putting on, if I may, my old conservative hat, it always struck me that conservatives would prioritize giving to their alma mater because they had friends there, but whatever, there's such strong emotional ties in order that these schools would then one day train their children to become communists, while their philanthropy, it's their money to determine where they want it to go or not go. But if education is the priority, to me, the screaming interest was for K through 12. So I think this is a thing that's lost on many philanthropists, or that, if I may use again the portfolio, it really should include a K through 12. What's the point of, I don't get it when there's such need there. Does Harvard need another $1 million on top of its 35 billion existing? So that's my, I'm not a participant. I'm the host. I'm not supposed to be giving spiels, but having said that, am I wrong? If you were advising a philanthropist who was just generally open about wanting to support education reform, would you tell them, listen, what's really needed in America is K through 12? And if I may, and each of you can answer this, is there a certain point where it's really necessary, if we're thinking at a grade level as opposed to an institution level? Is it before the third? We really need to put resources into K through 3, because that really matters for the effectiveness of of consequence of your charitable giving. So there's a big spiel. Sherry, what are your thoughts on that? And by the way, Bruno, I remember the question. It's like two great examples of charter schools. So, but we'll get to that later. Go ahead, Sherry.
It came back to me too, but that's
okay.
I'm so glad I'm not the only one that has those moments. Well, I think, yes, you're right. First of all, Jack, that philanthropists do have a fund tendency to want to give to their alma maters. And so I would advise them to think about, what are their philanthropic goals? And if it is, you notice on your campus, there isn't an opportunity to be exposed to free market economics, then perhaps you could endow a chair to fill that gap. Another way to have an impactful engagement philanthropically with your school is also to look at the centers. Mercatus, I think that George Mason is doing great work along, those lines of free market economics and others. And so, that you can be focused and strategic about your giving at the university level, because we've all heard stories. I talked to a gentleman earlier this year. His father had left money to his alma mater. He was, a kid that didn't have a whole lot of money, but he won a tennis scholarship to the university. And he went on to, create a very successful business and wanted to give back. But the university decided to build tennis courts instead of honoring his intent. So donor intention is really key. And we would advise, any gifts, particularly to universities, that you make it explicit in writing, and so that there's no, misunderstanding about how you'd like to see those funds be used.
Bruno, is philanthropic support at an earlier grade level, if that was possible, should that be a priority, or am I missing a point, my own point?
No, well, frankly, I'm of two minds here. There is some significant amount of evidence that suggests, for example, if a young person is not able to read by the 4th grade, they're in real trouble going forward. Which suggests that, support directed toward funding at an early age in elementary school that might target something like evidence-based reading, and there is that talks about that's based on what in the old days we might have called phonics instruction and so on, has a big payoff over the course of a young person's lifetime, because if they're not able to read by 4th grade, they're in real trouble going forward. That would suggest that the kind of early intervention is important. On the other hand, I don't think that's the only significant intervention that can be made.
Okay.
That also has longer term impacts, positive impacts.
What's another one? What's another type?
Well, on the other end, let me go to the other end to make
Okay.
a point. And there are examples in the book of how these what have come to be called career pathway programs that begin as early as middle school, but that really take their shape in high school, that involve placing young people in apprenticeships and having work-based learning that's tied back to the school, have significant payoffs if a person goes on to college or directly into the workforce. So a good example of this is a Jesuit network of schools called Cristo Rey.
Right.
There are now 30 some of them in 20 some states. Beginning with freshman year, every young person is placed in a work environment 1 day a week. They earn money, part of which goes back to pay some of their tuition, et cetera. So, I think there are ways to invest smartly in both ends of the spectrum and even in between, which have payoffs in a variety of different ways. Now, the early investment has a payoff in making sure a young person is able to read. On the other end, having this work experience has a payoff too, particularly if much of it is linked to the curriculum that you have in the high school.
Ben, I'm not going to let you answer the question. I'm going to throw a new one at you, because we have a few questions from our viewers. And one of them's from Kurt, my buddy Kurt, who's a great, like me, a great fan of the St. Louis Browns. Of course, they went out, they moved in 1954. But Kurt asks, having been a K through 12 school district board member in an 11,000 suburban district for 12 years, I think a student, the toughest part of talking about magnet, charter, school choice was the closed culture of the district. The strong teachers union and the lack of interest in change from the administration shut down discussion whenever this concept was brought forth by the board. In areas and districts where charters and choice have been successful, how have they won over the closed culture that likes the status quo and feels threatened about change? Ben?
That's a big question and a good question. I guess to frame an answer on that, I actually want to start by quoting a former president, Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt said, "To educate a person in the mind, but not in morals, is to educate a menace to society." I think one of the great challenges we're having in our K-12 public systems is that we're not forming students with strong faith and strong character. We're not forming them morally. And so we are educating menaces to society. I think in public school systems where we're able to break through that, where there's enough community coherence and values and norms, so that we're continuing to be able to provide a moral foundation to our students, I think we're still seeing some success. Although I would argue it's more marginal than the kind of success we can see in faith environments or classical schools with strong character formation. So I think it all boils down to that moral premise and foundation on which good education either sits or does not.
Ben, and Sherry, I'm going to get to you with a question from one of our viewers. Ben, if you heard Bruno talk about Cristo Rey as a laudable type of system. What is something in your long experience in charter schools and education reform? What is something existing place that you would point a philanthropist who was game to fund something worthwhile? Maybe it's new and up and coming, has a lot of potential, but give some advice on something you think is worth other people knowing about, success stories.
I agree with what Bruno described as a continuum from deep within the system of government that runs public schools to well placed outside of the system of government. And I think philanthropists that want to generate meaningful change that's constructive for children are going to direct their resources towards the types of choices on that spectrum that are furthest outside. And I would argue that that's things like private schools, homeschooling resources, like quality online programs. I think in some cases it's charter schools, although charter schools are going through a tremendous amount of re-regulation right now, and they're getting pulled into the system, which is something that Milton Friedman warned us would happen 25 years ago. So I think philanthropists are well advised to try to find those opportunities to really direct resources outside where it's possible to really form strong moral character, to really support families as the primary unit of education and formation of children. That's where donor resources are highest leverage.
Before Sherry, I get to you, I forgot I have to make some commercial announcements very quickly because there's other things coming up in the world of the Center for Civil Society on the 25th in 2 days. And if you go to American Philanthropic and there's an events thing, click on it. There's a plethora of wonderful things. In a few days, there's a master class where we're teaching on acquiring, retaining, and upgrading your most valuable donors. Next week on the 31st, the great Jeremy Beer will be hosting a Scotch talk with Mike Jones on the power of branding, totally free. On the next day, Thursday, September 1st, there's a master class being offered by American Philanthropic on the elements of grant making. And finally, on October 11th through the 13th, one of the epic courses that American Philanthropic offers 2 or 3 times a year, elements of fundraising training, will be taking place in Philadelphia. I'm not going to tell that joke about Philadelphia. You know, who was it? Somebody won a prize, 3rd place, 3 nights in Philadelphia. 2nd place was 2 nights in Philadelphia. 1st place is 1 night. Well, that's a New York Giant fan view of Philadelphia. Sorry. So anyway, Sherry, we have a question from Christian Kopf. Are not private schools, this sort of gets in what Ben was saying, are not private schools, secular, religious, and parochial, as an alternative, as much better than charter schools as charter schools? As an alternative, are better than all but the best normal public schools, and for many of the same reasons in both cases? I mean, you were very engaged in bringing a choice to Christian schools, I assume Catholic schools in Milwaukee in part. So you've been in the trenches in this area. What are your thoughts of essentially empowering the existing parochial system in part?
I think successful schools are a lot alike successful, any other successful institution, in that they come together around a mission. They're mission driven, and everybody knows what that is, whether it is the development of, virtuous, students, and developing, their God-given talents, or whatever it is, that everybody in that building knows what the mission is and is committed to it, and knows what their part is in, developing, the education, the minds of the young people in the building. So I think it's hard to say whether it's in or out of the system. I do agree with Ben. I think that outside of the system, it's easier. There's more flexibility. You do have, opportunities that the traditional public schools don't, that I think, enhance excellence in the classroom. But again, it doesn't matter what the type of school is if you don't have folks who are committed to this, that are mission driven and committed to that mission, be it educating children or, making widgets.
Right.
That success is much less likely.
Jack, could
Bruno, go ahead.
We've been, and Sherry just talking, reminded me of this. We've been talking about donors doing X, Y, or Z directly.
Right.
But I don't think a donor has to necessarily think about doing things directly, because that could scare people off in some respects. It's a lot of work. You could go through something like a donor advised fund,
Right,
who will help you think these issues through, and negotiate the kind of difficulties that are part of the stuff we're talking about. There are other intermediaries out there. I don't know how many people have heard of the VELA fund, VELA fund, that aggregates donor dollars. It's not exactly a donor advised fund, but it kind of works in the same way. They provide grants that are mini grants that are $10,000 to $15,000 to things like people who want to start a homeschool co-op, to, again, the other end of the continuum, people who want to expand a charter model that may get $250,000 to $300,000 grants from them. I forget the name of the micro school that started in Arizona that is now expanding in a variety of different places, but they got money from VELA to start up. So that there are ways for donors to think about doing this without fear of having to get into a bunch of issues that maybe you don't want to deal with, or that you don't want to think through, but you have some sense that, yeah, I'd like to do something outside the system. I need some help doing it. Go to a donor advised fund, go to a group like VELA, and have them help you think this through.
we have a few minutes left, and I think when we end, I'm going to put the onus on you that you had a little money and you could spend it in one sector of education reform. What would you do? And assuming that's how you would advise others. But Bruno, before we get there, education reform implies that education needs reforming. Support for education reform, assume it has an outcome. The outcome is likely that students are performing better and taught better and educated better and taking advantage of part of what you write about in your book, relationships that are going to lead to opportunities for becoming, successful citizens. But I do think one of the aspects of education reform that's important is its effect. It's on civil society. I mean, the downside of having a education system in disarray and collapse or just poorly performing is its harming of civil society. But the flip side is education reform helps our communities. You've written about this in some ways. Would you talk about that a little before we get into our closing questions?
Sure. I'd almost go back to what Ben was saying earlier. You want people to know more, but you also want them to be better people.
Yeah.
You want them to be good citizens. That's really the ultimate outcome. And citizenship involves an immersion in and a respect for civil society, the sort of mediating institutions that give life to what we do. So I think this is a key aspect, a key outcome, maybe not an immediate one, but it is an outcome that we need to strive to achieve in a variety of ways. And I'd go back just to, I think, a good way to think about what charter schools do. Charter schools are basically voluntary communities.
Right.
People are there because they want to be there, not because the district told them you have to go there. So these are voluntary communities, which are a core part of this thing that we call civil society. This voluntary affiliation, voluntary association that gives life to people and that makes them better people. So I think that this outcome that's related to civil society, or Ben talked about being a better person, is very, very, very much should be at the center of what a donor tries to do in the investments they make in K-12 education or education more broadly.
I think we all think of donors as other people, but the fact is, when you look in the mirror, there's a donor looking back at you, and the Good Samaritan didn't know he was going to be the Good Samaritan until he was faced with the need to engage in charity. All of us have to do that. So whether it's the widow's mite or $100 million that Jeff, not Jeff, whatever his name is, Zuckerberg dumped on Newark, we have means to give. So if I ask, as we end this webinar, and first, before I do, I want to thank Caitlin Nacera, John Hanna, Jacob Bucko, Laura Bernhoff, my other colleagues who helped put this together. I would like to know if you had the widow's mite or a sizable amount of money and you wanted to invest it in an area of education reform, whether it be an institution or whatever, how would you spend that money? And this is something to influence the donors of the world. Sherry, why don't you tell us how you would spend your $100?
I think I would look at policies that are working to change how we fund education in this country, to fund students versus schools. And I think, if we think children are all created equal, I think it's time we started to fund them equally. From charter schools to public schools to private school choice program schools, their funding is different. And so it puts, those schools that give fewer dollars at a disadvantage. And so I think that's something that I would put my funding in is, looking at opportunities to impact policies that change how schools, how education is funded.
Bruno?
I would just add, as opposed to say something different. I would look at programs, at approaches that take what I would call a two-generation approach to things, namely those that focus on the family and kids. Mm-hmm. And that could cut across a variety of different, institutional manifestations. But I think that's what I would use as a sort of pair of lens to begin to think about making a contribution. By the way, to you, Bruno and Sherry and Ben, if any of you have written like what you've just talked about, Bruno, if you have an article on that point, please, you got my email address, send it, and I'd like to share it with our with the viewers of today's webinar. Ben, we have a minute left and you get the last word. How would you expend your charitable dollars on education reform?
Jack, for the last 2.5 years, I've been donating my time and treasure, serving alongside of Jamie Jo Scott, the board chair of the Albertson Family Foundation, Tom Nikoloff with the Nikoloff Family Foundation, Christy Burton with the Burton Family Foundation, Arizona, to design and to prepare to launch a new initiative called the Central States Education Initiative. And it's a regional initiative where we want to accelerate the supports and resources available to community up educators to start new entrepreneurial ventures. And we want to do that from the grassroots up, create more supports for them. And through that, we want to change the profession of K-12 education in our region and hopefully over time nationally. So that's what I'm doing.
That deserves its own webinar. So maybe we will do that. Well, Sherry, Bruno, Ben, thank you so much. You've really provided a lot of wisdom, a lot of guidance. I thank you again to thank my colleagues at American Philanthropic and the Center for Civil Society, and those of you who joined us today. Thanks very much, and we will be back soon. And I think in October we will have a webinar on religious freedom. So please, you'll hear about it. Join us then. Thanks, everyone. God bless.
Thank you so much,
Thank
Jeff.
you. Enjoyed it.
Bye-bye.